اوكي، بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. نرحب بالجميع، نرحب بكل الزملاء والزميلات من كافة اقطار الوطن العربي، نرحب بالزملاء والزميلات من دول مجلس التعاون الخليجي، نرحب بالمتحدث وممثل الحوار، ويسعد مكتب الترجمة العربي لدول الخليج، وهو يستعد لمواصلة نشاطه للعام 2021. يبدأها مع فعاليات تتحدث عن السياسات التربوية التعليمية، ومثل ما وعدناكم دوما وعودناكم دوما أن تكون فعالياتنا بعضها موجه لصناع السياسات وبعضها تطبيقات وممارسات. اليوم مع البداية الجديدة في الدورة المالية الجديدة 2021-2022 نبدأ مع مواضيع السياسات التربوية والتعليمية، وبالتأكيد بأن كوفيد و19 وأثرها على العملية التربوية والتعليمية هي في عمق الحدث، باعتبار أن هذا الحدث أثر على أعمالنا وأشغالنا بشكل كامل. ولعل لقاءنا اليوم عبر هذا التواصل الغير مباشر أو عبر الزوم هو واحد من الآثار الإيجابية لتلك الجائحة. إجمالا نرحب بالدكتورة نجوى الحوسني، وهي أستاذة في التربية، العميد القائمة أعمال عميد كلية التربية بجامعة الإمارات العربية المتحدة، وهي عضو مجلس الأمناء للمركز العربي للبحوث التربوية التابع لمكتب التربية العربية لدول الخليج، وهي من الناشطات تربوية وباحثة وعالمة تساهم في كثير من القضايا التربوية والتعليمية في دول الخليج وفي الوطن العربي، باعتبارها متخصصة في المناهج وطرق التدريس، يعني متخصصة في هذا المجال. لنا الشرف أن تكون معنا في هذا اللقاء، وسوف تقدم متحدثنا الرئيسي وتدير هذه الندوة. نرحب بها ونرحب بكم جميعا، ونؤكد للجميع أولا وجود ترجمة على أيقونة الترجمة، بالإمكان الضغط على أيقونة الترجمة وتختار العربي والإنجليزي، وأيضا تم إرسال اللي هو العرض المرئي للمتحدث باللغة العربية واللغة الإنجليزية ضمن رسالتنا الجماعية لجميع الزملاء والزميلات المشاركين معنا في هذا اليوم. مرة ثانية أرحب بكم باسم مكتب التربية العربية دول الخليج وباسم مديره العام الدكتور علي بن عبد الخالق القرني، الذي تعذر أن يكون معنا اليوم لارتباطه بأشغال أخرى تخص المكتب. باسمي وباسم زملائي وباسم الكادر الفني والتربوي والتعليمي وباسم ايضا الاخوه في التقنيه نرحب بكم جميعا. ومرحبا دكتوره، المجال لك، تفضلي.
شكرا سعادة الدكتور عبد السلام الجوفي على هذا التقديم، حفظك الله، وعلى بركة الله نبدأ هذه الجولة المعرفية في هذه الندوة المتميزة. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين، معالي الأخ المبارك الدكتور علي عبد الخالق القرني، المدير العام لمكتب التربية العربي لدول الخليج، أصحاب السعادة، الحضور الكريم، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته، وأسعد الله مساءكم بالخير والبركة. يسعدني ويشرفني في هذا اليوم الجميل أن أكون جزءاً من هذه الندوة المتميزة التي تحمل عنوان الفاقد التعليمي أثناء وبعد جائحة كورونا، نظرة دولية، التي ينظمها المكتب العربي للتربية لدول الخليج، والذي يسعى دائماً إلى دعم المنظومة التعليمية في الدول الأعضاء من خلال المساهمات القيمة التي تثري الممارسات التعليمية وتعمل على تحقيق الأهداف المرجوة. فبوركتم وبوركت جهودكم. استسمحكم بالبدء في هذه الندوة، والتي ستتناول هذا الموضوع الهام الذي يتعلق بجائحة كوفيد-19 والأثر الكبير الذي ألقى بظلاله على جميع مناحي الحياة وخصوصاً المنظومة التعليمية. أود التنويه للحضور الكريم أن الندوة ستستغرق من 30 إلى 35 دقيقة بإذن الله تعالى، وسنترك الوقت المتبقي للأخوة والأخوات الكرام لطرح أسئلتهم ومقترحاتهم واستفساراتهم على المتحدث الكريم في المساحة المخصصة لذلك في قسم Q&A، وسأقوم بعد ذلك بانتهاء إن شاء الله الندوة للمناقشة والحوار. كما أود التنويه إلى أن هناك شهادات للحضور الكريم بشرط أن لا تقل فترة تواجدهم معنا 60% من الوقت المخصص للندوة، والإجابة أيضاً على التقييم الخاص بالندوة الذي سيرسل عبر البريد الإلكتروني، كما ستصل شهاداتكم بإذن الله عبر البريد الإلكتروني الذي تم من خلاله التسجيل لهذه الندوة. الأخوة والأخوات المباركين، كما تعلمون جائحة كوفيد-19 أوجدت أكبر انقطاع في نظام التعليم في التاريخ، وهو ما تضرر به ملايين الطلبة في جميع القارات، وتأثرت المدارس في كل دول العالم بسبب هذا الإقلاع، والذي أدى إلى عرقلة إيصال الخدمات التعليمية للطلبة باختلاف مستوياتهم العمرية ومستوياتهم المعرفية. كما أن الجائحة تسببت في زيادة الضغوط المالية والاقتصادية على الأنظمة التعليمية، وأدت أيضاً إلى تفاقم الفجوات الهائلة في التمويل المرصود للتعليم. وللتعريف والتعرف أكثر على هذه الأبعاد، يسعدني ويشرفني اليوم أن يكون معي في هذه الندوة الدكتور هاري باترينوس. الدكتور هاري باترينوس هو مدير الممارسات التعليمية لمنطقة أوروبا وآسيا الوسطى في مجموعة البنك الدولي. يعمل السيد باترينوس في أغلب مجالات التعليم، لا سيما المتصلة بالإدارة القائمة على المدرسة وتمويل التعليم والشراكات بين القطاعين العام والخاص. أدار عمليات إقراض التعليم وبرامج العمل التحليلية في الأرجنتين وكولومبيا والمكسيك، بالإضافة إلى مشروع بحث إقليمي عن الوضع الاجتماعي والاقتصادي للشعوب الأصلية في أمريكا اللاتينية. نشر الدكتور هاري تحت عنوان الشعوب الأصلية والفقر والتنمية البشرية في أمريكا اللاتينية، وهو أيضاً أحد المؤلفين الرئيسيين لتقرير التعلم عن مدى الحياة في اقتصاد المعرفة العالمي. للسيد باترينوس العديد من المنشورات في الأدب الأكاديمي والسياسات، وله أيضاً أكثر من 40 مقال في المجلات العلمية. كما شارك في تأليف العديد من الكتب، نذكر منها على سبيل المثال تحليل سياسات عمالة الأطفال، دراسة مقارنة، وكتاب اللامركزية في التعليم، تمويل جانب الطلب، والسكان الأصليون والفقر في أمريكا اللاتينية. كما عمل في أفريقيا وآسيا وأوروبا والشرق الأوسط وأمريكا الشمالية. عمل سابقاً كخبير اقتصادي في المجلس الاقتصادي الكندي، وحصل دكتور هاري على درجة الدكتوراه من جامعة ساكسكس في المملكة المتحدة. رحبوا معي بالدكتور هاري لإلقاء محاضرته اليوم بإذن الله تعالى. Please, Dr. Hari, the screen is yours. You have from 30 to 35 minutes for your lecture.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Pleasure to be here. I look forward to sharing my work on the economic costs of the COVID-19 pandemic. Let me bring up the presentation.
صلاح جيب له الرايت.
I hope it is visible.
Yes.
Excellent. So as we all know, by mid-April of 2020, more than 190 countries had closed their schools and universities. This affected more than 90% of the world's students, 1.5 billion plus children and young people were not in school. We also know that education brings many benefits. One of those benefits is that people with more education eventually earn more in the labor market. In fact, every year of schooling raises annual earnings by a significant amount. About 8% has been estimated across the world. So a large wage benefit to every year of schooling. Therefore, lack of schooling would lead to less earnings. We also know that pandemics, past pandemics and epidemics have affected labor market outcomes. We know from way back, the Black Death had significant impacts in the labor markets, in addition to all the, of course, the deaths. We know that the Spanish flu had a significant impact on lower incomes. And in fact, not only the immediate consequences of the pandemics, but the long-lasting social and economic effects. It's been estimated that the Spanish epidemic reduced incomes for several decades for people affected. And of course, countries lost significant amounts of national income. And some of those impacts on the people that were affected, including children that were born during the epidemic, had suffered significant socioeconomic disadvantages that lasted well into the 1980s. So we expect pandemics to have large immediate impacts, of course, but also consequences, including less schooling, poorer health outcomes, poorer labor market outcomes as well. So in estimating the costs of school closures, we can look at two kinds of losses. One is the learning loss that will occur with the absence of schooling, the children not being in lessons, and the other is the earnings loss. And here I mean future earnings loss. Of course, during pandemics and during the lockdowns, adults lost income because they couldn't work. But what we're talking about here is the future earnings losses of students once they complete their schooling. We can think of the losses, whether it's learning or earnings, to increase over time. So the longer we're in lockdown, the longer that the schools are closed, you can expect more loss to take place. So if you try to create an image of typical learning in a school year, it increases with each academic year. And what should happen if that schooling is taken away is that the learning gains will start to decrease, and you end up with a gap. And we expect that the longer the closure, the greater the aggregate amount of learning loss. And the same could be said for earnings as well. The World Bank estimated the potential learning loss associated with school closures and made three predictions. This is back in the spring and summer of 2020. So just when the closures were at their height, the bank estimated that these are global PISA scores, the OECD's student assessment of 15-year-olds done every 3 years. And the average score is 440 points. And what the bank estimated was if the closures are only 2 or 3 months, there will be a small but significant decrease in learning. If they go to 5 or 6 months, a much larger loss in learning. And the difference between the baseline of 440 points and the pessimistic scenario is almost 30 points, which is close to a year of learning. So 5-6 months is a significant amount of the school year. So there's potentially a loss of a school year due to the closures. The bank also estimated the proportion of students that may fall below the minimum learning levels as defined by the OECD. So we're talking about 15-year-olds. This is effectively functional illiteracy, and a baseline of 40% of those students that take PISA are below this level. And with the pessimistic scenario, it could rise to 53%. So it would mean that the majority of students are below this minimum proficiency level. So pretty stark predictions based on a linear model, taking into consideration that how long the closures take place. One will say, well, maybe the losses won't occur because there is mitigation measures. And the first mitigation measure that the countries put in place was distance education. It could have been online education. It could have been broadcasts. We have experience with television. In some countries used radio. In some very remote areas, we heard that they were using the mail and hand delivery of lessons to students. So there is mitigation during the school closures, but we also know that there's limited capacity. Even in the best systems, they weren't prepared for mass school closures. Our distance education systems were not designed to cater to the whole student population being out of school at the same time. The other constraint is in the students' homes, the connectivity may not be perfect. We know that internet rates of penetration are quite high, but in some countries, especially in certain regions, they don't exist. So there's limited connectivity, so it reduces the options that countries have for distance education. Also, if the distance learning is done in a way that the lessons are broadcast, television and the like, it reduces the ability for teachers to interact with the students. So the interaction will be diminished when it's online. And finally, there are many reports of poor attendance. The longer the school closures took place, the more likely it was that students simply did not show up or participate for their online or distance education system. So mitigation measures were heroic efforts by governments to continue learning during the closures, but it's limited because we weren't prepared for the mass school closures. Systems weren't prepared for this. And what we had instead was emergency remote teaching. So not the same as what perhaps we would have designed ideally for a system with mass school closures. So very soon after the school closures took place, there were various estimates of the economic costs of the school closure. So if the learning losses materialize, that means that people are getting less education and therefore learning less, and the less you learn, the less schooling you have, theoretically you will be earning less once you reach the labor market. The first study we saw was a government study from Iceland that estimated the number of lost days of schooling and equated this to future earnings of those students and produced some large losses. In the United States, there's been several studies estimating the likely earnings losses, and the most of the loss was estimated to be for those with higher levels of education. So people with university more likely to lose more earnings in the future. The UK study early in the pandemic estimated that students would lose about 3% a year in earnings throughout their career as a result of the school closures in the UK. A study in Canada estimated those that will graduate during this this period would face a labor market with higher unemployment rates, and their earnings would be up to 25% less than they would have been without the crisis, at least for the first 5-10 years of their careers. A study from Australia also used the estimate of the 8% a year of earnings gains to show that, again, very similar to the UK, about a 2 to 3% reduction in earnings for students once they enter the labor market. And then there are several global studies. The World Bank study estimated the learning losses and also estimated the future earnings losses for students, and came up with a global number that for those students in primary and secondary schooling, not preschool, not university, only primary and secondary schooling is a result of less learning and less education in terms of years of schooling. The global cost of the closures was estimated to be more than $10 trillion. Future losses for students over their lifetimes. We'll talk more about the assumptions behind these studies and what this might mean. So we took a different angle on this and looked at the economic cost, again using future earnings as the measure of economic cost. And we're looking at the lifetime reduction of earnings for students from 205 countries, high-income countries, middle-income and low-income countries, and we estimate losses by level of education. So in our study, we include all students in primary, secondary, and university. So a little bit different from other studies. Our estimates suggest a $15 trillion loss in lifetime earnings because we include university students who earn much more than those with secondary or primary. And of course, these are earnings, again, over a lifetime. We estimate a working life of about 45 years. And in terms of countries' national income or GDP, this is 12 to 18% of current year GDP, but over a lifetime. In terms of annual reduction in GDP, we estimate a 0.8% annual reduction in earnings. So large, potentially very large losses. How do these compare to the other studies? Very, very similar. Everyone took as a starting point a annual increase in earnings of about 8%, and with the reduction in schooling due to quality or to quantity or both, this reduces potential earnings by a significant amount. We can break this down by level of education, and of course, at the individual level, annual losses for primary schooling globally are about $200, $300. At the secondary level, much higher amount at the tertiary. These numbers don't sound like big losses, but once we aggregate them to lifetime, they start to add up. And again, it's higher for those with higher levels of schooling. So potential losses could be significant at the individual level. We are also expecting differentiated effects, meaning that some students will suffer more than others. One of the groups that's likely to suffer more are those with less education. And the theory behind these differentiated effects is that because educational attainment increases cognitive skills, therefore those with more education score higher on cognitive skills measures. Also, more educated workers are better able to cope during the crisis and the pandemic, that the crisis and the recession that will ensue. And those with more education are able to gather more information about jobs and find something related to what they want to do. And we've seen from past economic crises, we don't have the detailed evidence of pandemics, and there's been nothing like the COVID-19 crisis for a very long time. But we know from past economic crises that, of course, national income decreases. In the case of Argentina, several very large financial crises led to reductions in national income. But if you look at the returns to education, they don't decrease very much. In fact, those with higher levels of schooling tend to increase their rates of return during crises. Doesn't mean that they're earning more. It means that the relative wages between those with more and less education have increased. And they've increased because those with less education are more likely to lose jobs, more likely to take lower paying occupations, while those with higher education tend to maintain their position. So inequality also increases as a result of pandemics. Same pattern more recently with the financial crisis in Greece. Again, very, very large reductions in national income, but the relative wage benefit for those with higher education actually increased during the crisis, and it tends to stay high post-crisis as well. We've seen the same pattern in Pakistan, large decreases in income, but the returns to education increase, again, because those with less than university tend to suffer more. We've seen similar patterns in Indonesia as well for the same reasons. So and South Africa, much smaller impact crises, yet the returns to those with higher education increase during the crisis. So we expect that that the impacts will be large in terms of earnings losses, and the relative losses will be greater for those with less education. So the first question is, all of this was predictions. All of these predictions were made between, I would say, April and maybe August of 2020. And the question is, all of these estimates expect that the school closures will lead to less education, less time in school, less learning, lower test scores. And the question is it true that the school closures will result in less learning, or in other words, the COVID-19 slide in education? And the information is starting to come in. We have solid research from Belgium and Netherlands. In Belgium, they have a longitudinal study that tests students every year and follows them up. And what they found is a loss in learning of about 19 to 29% of a standard deviation. So you can assume that about a 0.3 of a standard deviation is about a year of schooling. So these are large losses in Belgium as a result of their school closure. In the Netherlands, again, rigorous work and annual tests of students suggest a reduction in learning of 8% of a standard deviation, much smaller, though significant amount compared to Belgium. But the difference between the Netherlands and Belgium is the school closures, the first wave. This is first wave of school closures, of course. First wave in Netherlands was only 8 weeks, whereas in Belgium it was 3 months. So again, if you go back to the estimates that the World Bank made with the different scenarios of the optimistic and the pessimistic scenario, you can consider Netherlands very close to the optimistic scenario and Belgium much closer to the pessimistic. So the longer the school closure, even in high income, high performing education systems, learning losses were significant and large. These are also countries that tend to do very well in these international assessments. Netherlands has a very strong system of technology, but even there losses occurred. In both studies, the losses were concentrated among those from more disadvantaged families. So the relatively poorer students did poor on these tests, significantly more poor on these tests. So the inequality increased as well. Similar findings, but different kind of test in Switzerland. Reduction in learning in the UK. It's been recently confirmed with another study. And Kazakhstan also reports an 11% reduction in test scores. There are many more reports from many districts in the United States of lower test scores, more students scoring failing grades compared to last year. Reports from several Canadian provinces, Korea, and Jamaica so far that we know. Only one study I've been able to find suggested that that learning losses didn't occur. That was a study of one faculty in one university in Spain, students in STEM subjects, and in fact, online learning was beneficial for these students. So perhaps at the higher education level, we might see less learning loss, but definitely the studies across the world and the reports so far have found that the learning losses are real and significant and concentrate among those who are already either from poor backgrounds or less prepared in schooling. So learning losses as measured by these cognitive tests, I would say, are real. And most of the most robust evidence from Belgium and Netherlands, these are quite robust studies and well implemented studies, suggest large learning losses, and we can expect that this will be the model for the rest of the world. In other words, the COVID slide is real, and also I forgot to mention Kenya. We've also seen learning losses. They had a very long school closure in that country. And I mentioned the US. There's been 4 national studies suggesting learning losses, 19 reports so far that we've been able to find. And I mentioned the one case in Spain at the higher education level in one faculty in one university. But the national studies at the primary and secondary level do confirm learning losses. So far, this is about test scores and future wages, but there are other costs of school closures. In a medical journal, a study was published suggesting that school closures will lead to loss of life in the future, assuming that because education is correlated with life expectancy, this will reduce life expectancy, so less schooling, lower life expectancy. So they estimated lost life, they estimated mental health impacts, and we're getting reports of those as well. Childcare issues, as students have to stay home, parents are therefore needed to supervise their lessons. So we hear of parents dropping out of labor market, and this is of course increasing inequality, because it's more likely that women will drop out of the labor market. So many of the gains women have had in the labor market in recent years are being prevented because of the crisis. So many other costs of school closures that are affecting families and countries. So the response in the first instance, of course, was the efforts by many governments to continue learning, to put in place the emergency remote system. And this is entirely necessary. It won't be sufficient to reduce learning loss, but we have learned the lesson that to mitigate learning loss, we do need strong distance education systems designed for the school system to keep the curriculum online. So investments in connectivity and the IT infrastructure are necessary components of that effort, as is the production of digital content. We saw many countries producing the lessons on a daily basis to make sure that the lessons continued during the lockdown. More of this, of course, is needed. And then, of course, building the capacity in the ministries of education, among teachers and students to be able to access the lessons and to create lessons and to find the tools that will enhance learning during the closures. As we move out of the school closures, attention was immediately turned to the question of learning loss recovery. So now we know that learning loss will occur even with distance education. Therefore, we need to focus on recovery. And this requires programs to specifically bring back the level of learning. It also requires that we think about the education budget. During crises and recessions, we tend to see social sector budgets decrease. It's important at this time to protect the education budget in order to fulfill the role of learning loss recovery. And it's important that systems prepare for future shocks, because we expect to some level for this to happen again. So what do you do next time schools closed? To be prepared and to build back better. This is the time to look at what reforms countries have wanted to do in education that are needed, but now might be the time to think about it as they build back their systems and try to make them stronger. So in terms of learning recovery programs, I would mention three things are needed. One is just-in-time assessments. And here I'm not talking about examinations or selection tests. I'm talking about assessments that will allow the teachers to know what has happened in the to their students during the closures, how far behind they are on the lessons, who has fallen behind, so they can organize their teaching to address the specific requirements. What seems to work during the crisis and after is what's called high dosage tutoring, or specific instruction, even one-on-one with students. There was an experiment in Italy during the school closures where they mobilized university students, gave them a rapid training and allowed them to help the students that were doing distance education usually, and the scores increased significantly. And there's a large literature on high dosage tutoring that tends to show that learning increases. The third suggestion is the programs that are known as Teach at the Right Level. This again requires assessments of students and then catering lessons directly for what those students need in order to improve their performance in the lesson. So we need to focus our attention on those in need, to have information about where they are and to improve learning very quickly. Protecting the education budget, again, avoiding budget cuts and also targeting spending. There may be needs for one-off budget increases, perhaps to finance the tutoring programs, for example, as is the case in the UK, but also for direct support to teachers to be able to cater to the learning losses. In terms of building back better, capacity for virtual education needs to be increased. We need flexible curricula that can be taught in person or online, or even better, a combination in the future. And of course, the value of teachers has been confirmed throughout these school closures. And definitely we need to support teachers so they can prepare lessons during these crises, but also so they can address the learning needs of students as they return one day to a more normal environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. شكرا جزيلا دكتور هاري على هذه المحاضرة القيمة التي يمكن أن ألخصها بهذه الفقرة بشكل سريع، لأن حقيقة هناك الكثير من الأسئلة التي نرغب في توجيهها للدكتور هاري. مثل ما تفضل الدكتور هاري، تأثر النظام التعليمي بسبب جائحة كوفيد-19، وتكلم أيضا عن الآثار السلبية التي طالت هذا المجال. تطرق أيضا إلى شرح لوضع وحالة الفاقد التعليمي في بعض الدول، والذي أثر على عدم حصول الطلبة في بعض الدول على بعض المهارات ومخرجات التعلم الخاصة بالقراءة والكتابة والرياضيات. كما تطرق دكتور هاري في النهاية إلى عرض بعض الحلول والأساليب التي يمكن تنفيذها للتقليل من هذا الفاقد التعليمي، من مثل الاستثمار في الاتصال في حالات الطوارئ، والبنية التحتية لتكنولوجيا المعلومات، إنتاج المحتوى الرقمي المناسب، بناء القدرات المؤسسية، وتنفيذ برامج علاجية للطلبة، وحماية ميزانية التعليم، وأخيراً الاستعداد للصدمات والأزمات المستقبلية من خلال الإعداد الجيد والاستفادة من الخبرات السابقة. فشكراً جزيلاً مرة أخرى دكتور هاري. حقيقة قبل أن أبدأ بأسئلة الجمهور، لدي سؤال دكتور هاري فيما يتعلق بضرورة إعادة هيكلة المناهج وطرق التدريس أثناء وبعد جائحة كوفيد. كيف ترى هذه الضرورة سيدي الكريم؟ Can you hear me, Dr. Hari? دكتور عبد السلام؟ هل فقدنا دكتور هاري؟ هل فقدنا الاتصال بدكتور هاري؟
اعمل القراءة اللي عندك دكتورة نجوى، وأنا سوف أتواصل معها أتأكد من النت.
دكتور عبد السلام؟
اي نعم معك دكتورة. واصلي الملخص الذي قلتيه أنت لحديث اليوم. يعني نعم. أنت بدأتي تتكلمي على أنه المعالجات، تكلمتي أنت على يعني القضايا التي ناقشها، فيا ريت مثلا بالإمكان أن تواصلي حتى نتأكد من أنه إعادة يعني عودته انضمام معنا. أعطيني دقيقة واحدة وسوف أعود لك.
أبشر دكتور. في الحقيقة كانت المحاضرة شيقة وكثير من المعلومات التي أتحفنا بها الدكتور هاري، طبعا بحكم خبرته في هذه الدول، وعندما نجعل يعني وضعنا الحالي في دولنا العربية أو دولنا الخليجية، الحمد لله يعني هناك بنى تحتية تقنية فائقة الجودة، يعني بفضل من الله انعكست انعكاسا إيجابيا على توفر على سبيل المثال الاتصال، الإنترنت لكل بيت ولكل طفل، ما عدا يعني بعض المناطق التي أيضا وجدت لها حلول علاجية بحيث أن يتم تغطيتها مثلا من إنترنت خاص أو بريبيد كاردز، يعني من قبل أيضا بعض المساعدات التي توجهت بها بعض المؤسسات مثل الاتصالات وغيرها لبعض العوائل وبعض الأسر. ويمكننا الحديث أيضا هنا عن الإنتاج الرقمي أو إنتاج المحتوى. حقيقة أنا هذا يعني أمر جدا يهمني بحكم أني أنا متخصصة في المناهج. أرى أن الآن حقيقة يجب أن نعيد النظر في موضوع محتوى المنهج الذي نصممه خصوصا في هذه الفترة. يعني جائحة كوفيد-19 لا يخفيكم أخوتي وأخواتي المباركين ألقت بظلالها على هذا المشهد، مشهد تصميم المناهج. كيف يمكننا أن نصمم برامج قابلة للتطبيق ويمكن أيضا أن تحقق مخرجات التعليم. هنا يرجع لنا الدكتور هاري. Welcome back دكتور هاري.
I'm sorry.
You're fine.
Did you get any of my presentation?
Yeah.
Yes,
you finished.
Okay.
You're fine. We are in the period of questioning now. So are you ready, Dr. Harry?
Yes, please, Doctor. Ready.
Yes. My question was, Dr. Harry, how do you see the necessity for curricular and delivery methods reformulation during and after COVID-19? كيف ترى ضرورة إعادة هيكلة المناهج وطرق التدريس أثناء أو بعد جائحة COVID-19?
Thank you. I would make two remarks on this. I think one is that the pandemic has taught us that we need to think of flexible curricula that can be taught anywhere, anytime, but also taught us the value of the teacher. If we ever forgot that, now we know it for sure. So I think having a way to deliver the curriculum flexibly in a way that combines the best of technology with the best of personal teaching is one lesson. The second is looking at what actually people need. And I think what we find is that even when learning can be done in terms of the content online, people are missing out on the socio-emotional skills, the interaction, the connectivity that you get from face-to-face and personal learning. And I think we need to find ways to make learning more personal and to focus on the whole needs, both the curriculum needs and the non-cognitive skills that we're missing from the lack of physical presence.
Great. A question regarding the World Bank. Are there a mechanism that the World Bank works right now to assist countries in working plans to overcome the educational loss? Dr. Harry?
Yes, thank you. Definitely when the crisis broke out, the attention was focused on the immediate health impacts. But we also worked on the social protection for the families. But when we turn to education, we look to support countries in the distance education system. As you mentioned in the introduction, I work in Europe and Central Asia. The first project that we did to support a country in during the closures was in Turkey. We supported the further development of their distance education platform. They have an excellent e-learning platform, but it wasn't designed for the 17 million students that were out of school. So we supported the capacity of the ministry to extend the reach of the program, to make it more secure, and to continuously develop the content that is required. And that was an emergency response, but I think it also will build a stronger education system. In other countries, we are also supporting the students in their learning programs. We're supporting ministries in the capacity to deliver education. And now we're turning attention to learning recovery programs through our education projects.
One question, Dr. Hari, I received from the audience regarding the learning loss or the educational loss. Who calculate this educational loss? Is it the teacher? Is it the school? Or there are specific reports that you get from the educational districts?
So in terms of actual learning losses, not the predictions, the actual learning losses, we're relying on the national reports. So some countries like Belgium have the longitudinal studies. Many of our countries and our projects also test students. We're expecting in the spring to get reports of the first year of learning loss. So it's the same national examinations that countries, national assessments that countries do every year. Some countries don't have these, and I think it's a big disadvantage, but these are the national tests that we're looking at.
Two more questions, Dr. Hari. I would like to have your insight on the impact of the pandemic on teaching and learning skills, especially in the early childhood and elementary stages.
This is an area that's very important, but we don't have measures for this. And I think the educators and the teachers in the audience, like yourself, will know very well that it's difficult to design these programs for very, very young children, right? I mean, if you can't read, it's pretty difficult to do this. So I think they're missing out very much on the education, because especially early preschool education is about social skills, socio-emotional development. It's not about reading and math. So very difficult to do much about those levels. So I suspect the losses there will be significant, and this should be a priority population, student population, to address, especially those that are going to enter school and they didn't have the preparation for this. So the very young, we can't measure learning outcomes very well, especially cognitive skills, and they will have missed out quite a bit. And this is an area of focus for the future, I believe.
The last question, Dr. Hari, regarding the psychological impact or the psychological effect on teachers, children, and their parents. What's your perspective on this?
Yeah, I mean, the research that I've done is focused on the earnings losses in the future, but there are many other studies that have looked at these of the social cost of the closures, the mental health aspects, and these are quite large and alarming levels, and something that needs to be taken into account. I think it's very difficult to address these in the short term, but we need to pay attention. We're also getting the reports about the stress levels of students, the stress levels of parents that either have to lose their jobs because they have to stay home, or they have to juggle both the career and effectively becoming a second teacher if the students are learning at home. That's quite a lot of pressure and stress that's being added, along with all the uncertainties that come with a pandemic that could affect your health and continues to extend. When we did the study, we thought, we're going to have school closures in the spring and then return to school in the fall, and that didn't work out as expected. So we're working very hard, as you are, as everyone is, to try to make the second year of COVID-19 less impactful than the first one by trying to combine some in-person teaching with distance education and to relieve some of the stress. I think it was good news, excellent news that vaccines are being rolled out, and pretty soon we'll have the immunization, but they will take time. So we need to consider that there's many other aspects to look at, but we're starting to get a handle on this. But I think research, active research, is required in my area to look at the earnings, potential earnings losses. What can be done in the short term to prevent these, right? I mean, we estimate these losses because we want to prevent them. So we have time to do some of these. Some of these things will work. I worry especially young children and older children who may be close to the end of their academic careers. Will they come back to school when it opens again? Will they ever have a chance to come back? We need to think about other alternatives for these students. Maybe they can combine work and school, but these are some of the questions that we need to answer very, very soon.
Thank you, Dr. Harry. Thank you very much for this informative answers. في النهاية أتوجه بخالص الشكر والتقدير للضيف الكريم دكتور هاري على هذا العرض الشيق والمعلومات المفيدة. وفي الختام لا يسعني إلا أن أتوجه أيضا بخالص الشكر والتقدير إلى معالي الدكتور علي عبد الخالق القرني المدير العام لمكتب التربية العربي لدول الخليج، وأشكر أيضا المنظمين والقائمين على هذه الندوة، وأشكر أخي الدكتور الفاضل عبد السلام الجوفي على كل هذا الجهد المبارك الذي بذله في هذه الندوة. أشكر الحضور الرائع على حسن الاستماع وطيب المشاركة. أستودعكم الله والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
شكرا دكتورة نجوى، شكرا دكتور هاري، سعداء جدا بوجود الجميع. نشكر هاري أيضا على إتاحة الفرصة في الوقت المبكر هذا. عندها الآن الساعة 7 صباحا، يعني بما معنى أنه حضر إلينا من الساعة 6 صباحا. شكرا للجميع. الحقيقة أنه يعني التعليم عملية اجتماعية وفعل اجتماعي، وكوفيد أثرت على مجمل العمليات الاجتماعية من النواحي النفسية والاجتماعية والثقافية والصحية والمالية، وبالتالي بالتأكيد بأن لها أثر كبير، وأن مستوى التحصيل لأبنائنا وبناتنا قد تأثر بشكل جاد، وعلينا أن لا نركن إلى ظواهر التعافي التربوية، ولكن علينا أن نبحث بعمق على ما أثرت الجائحة على عمق العملية التربوية التعليمية، ونستفيد من ممارسة الدولية. ونحن في مكتب التربية العربية لدول الخليج وباستضافتنا للسيد هاري وأيضا بإدارة السيدة نجوى حاولنا بقدر الإمكان أن نتعلم من الخبرات الدولية، أن نستفيد من ما يحدث في العالم، وهي عبارة عن إطلالة ليس فيها حلول ناجعة. لم نتوقع أن نجد إجابات على كل تساؤلاتنا وأسئلتنا، ولكنها عبارة عن يعني أدلة ماذا يحدث، كيف بالإمكان أن نعالج، كيف بالإمكان أن نستفيد من الآخرين، كيف بالإمكان أن نستفيد من التجربة الدولية. نحن لم نتوقع مثل ما قلت أن نجيب على الأسئلة، ولكن ربما أن هذه المحاضرة قد أثارت أيضا أسئلة جديدة، ليست فقط تلك المتعلقة بالتمويل، ولكن باستخدامات التمويلات المتاحة، وأيضا بالأثر النفسي على المعلمين والمعلمات، وأيضا على مجمل العملية التربوية التعليمية بكاملها، ومسؤولية التحصيل وآلية التعامل وآلية التعافي وآلية الخروج إلى بر الأمان بإذن الله تعالى للجميع. إجمالا مكتب التربية العربية لدول الخليج يشكر الجميع، يشكر السيد هاري ويشكر السيدة نجوى، وباسمه واسم معالي المدير العام الدكتور علي عبد الخالق، وباسم زملائي في مكتب التربية العربية لدول الخليج من الإعلاميين والفنيين، وأيضا الزملاء الرائعين في إدارة التقنية والمترجم الرائع، وكل الزملاء الفاعلين في مكتب التربية العربية لدول الخليج، وباسمهم جميعا نشكركم. وأكد بأن لدينا فعاليتنا القادمة سوف تكون في 2 مارس حول الموهبة، باعتبارها اليوم الخليجي الموهبة، وباعتبار أيضا ننتقل من مجال إلى مجال، وهكذا دائما في مكتب التربية العربية لدول الخليج نحاول أن نقدم لجميع الزملاء والزميلات ولكل الفاعلين التربويين في المنطقة العربية في دول الخليج على وجه الخصوص ما يمكن أن يكون مفيد، وما يمكن أن نستفيد منه لتطوير أهدافنا وغايتنا. شكرا جزيلا، شكرا للجميع، وبالتوفيق إلى اللقاء في لقاءات أخرى. شكرا هاري على الإتاحة، شكرا نجوى على هذا الإدارة الرائعة، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Thank you, Dr. Najwa. Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, everyone. Good to see you. Sorry about the connection issues. If any more questions, please please send them along. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank
Pleasure
you
to
very
have
much
you.
indeed. Thank you. Wish you the best.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.